Thank you very much. Nice to be with you. Talk about why Jesus is still good news. And I suppose you might have noticed this. There's a bit of an assumption baked into this topic that Jesus isn't generally perceived as good news anymore. That's probably the general feel that you get from society, from the media, from the general person on the street, that actually it's no longer, Jesus is no longer needed. Jesus is something from the past. Jesus and Christianity is something that we don't need anymore. So what I want to try and do is just try and share with you why Jesus is good news, why Jesus is able to bring hope and life and prosperity and all good things that we're kind of all struggling with and trying to reach out to and get, and society needs. I think the problem is that Christianity, there's been a perception about what Christianity is and what it's out to try and do, and it's been, Christianity is about trying to save yourself from earth, try and get to heaven, that kind of thing. Leave earth behind and try and escape this terrible place and try and go somewhere else, and leave the body, go with the soul, go up to heaven. And if you don't do any of that, then you're going to end up being burned in hell for and tormented forever, that kind of thing. And quite frankly, modern society is basically turning to that and thinking that's fable, that's myth, that's from the Dark Ages, that we don't need that. That's not true. We have no need of those sorts of ideas, and therefore rejecting that perception of God, rejecting that perception of religion, and Jesus himself is basically discarded and thrown out at the same time. And so society's perception of Christianity has basically, I think, perpetuated the decline, as it were, of those things. So what we need to do, I think, or what I want to do, is try and reshape what Christianity is, reshape what Jesus means and what he stands for, in a short amount of time, just to give a taster for why that is pretty much has missed the mark on lots of that perception of Christianity, why that's missed the mark, and why Jesus is therefore somebody that is so valuable for today's problems, today's issues, for society and for humanity at large. Jesus really is good news. So that's my challenge, really, to just give that a flavor of that in a short few minutes. What we're going to do then is we are going to just think very briefly about some of the problems that are in our day-to-day lives in society today and globally. We're then going to think about, well, what was good about Jesus 2,000 years ago? The question is, well, okay, Jesus might have brought some sort of good news 2,000 years ago, but he's no longer relevant. But what was it about him that was good? What was it about what he did and what he said and what he taught and what happened in his life? And we're going to consider what the good news about Jesus was 2,000 years ago. And that's really important. That's the bit where we're going to pretty much reshape, what Christianity, what the followers of Christ, the followers of Jesus, looks like, what that ought to look like compared to the sort of, the standard perception of what Christianity is. And then once we've done that, very, very briefly, we'll think about, well, how does that relate to today? The problems that we've identified, if we think about Jesus in this new light, in this new way, or in the original way, in the way that he always was, does that change the fact about whether or not he's useful and helpful and able to bring good news for this world today? So that's what we're going to be thinking about. We don't, and it's not the nicest part to dwell on, and we're not going to at all. I don't need to tell you what problems are today. I don't think there's anything unique about kind of the age that we live in. we've always had in humanity a rich and poor divide, a cost of living crisis that many people have to deal with. We've had people at the other end of the spectrum, people, basically making money at the expense of others. That always happens, and it's happening all the time, even in so-called non-corrupt countries like our own. And it's always been there, isn't it? There's poverty, there's a rich-poor divide, there's war throughout the world, and this year the threat of war has got so much closer to this country where we live, in a way that certainly in my lifetime absolutely had no experience of that at all. That had no concept of the fact that there could be war in Europe, but that's been completely obliterated, and it is indeed literally there. And then, of course, the threats of wider escalation of that happens, that could happen. I mean, there's political divides, aren't there, that weakens the powers of the government, and they can't do what they set out to do, and there's all sorts of dividing lines that just seem to get ever more acute and difficult. And then there's people escaping torture and death throughout the world, and they're fleeing to what they think are safe countries, and then they're faced with an awful system that is attempting to take them away and send them back, or send them somewhere else, not treating them like human beings. And there's hostility, there's suspicion of people who've been through such terrible things as refugees, and yet there's nowhere safe to turn to. And then there's environmental worries, and there's all sorts of issues, aren't there? So these sorts of things are real things in the 21st century. We deal with them sometimes on a day-to-day basis, whether that's filling up the car. These things affect us, our real lives, don't they? And then there's the wider thing. Well, where is this all going? What on earth is this world going to look like if war escalates, and if the environmental crisis gets worse, and all those sorts of things. Now, these issues, they're simply not solved by that perception of Christianity that you're a sinner, you'll go to hell unless you believe in Jesus, and then you can escape and go to heaven. There's no justice in that, is there? There's no restoration of the world that's in chaos. There's no justice for the people who are oppressed, and that sort of thing. There's no. It's a very individualistic view, and if that's what Christianity is, and if that's what Jesus stands for, then it really is missing the mark of the issues that collectively we as humanity face. So I can see, I have sympathy with the fact that if that's what Jesus is, if that's what he stands for, if that's what the good news is, then it really falls short in kind of addressing the problems in a really wholesome way. So what we need to do is think, okay, let's hold our conclusions, hold our thoughts on this. Let's just examine what Jesus meant in the 1st century AD. What did he mean 2,000 years ago? What was it about him that made people go around the Roman Empire and say there is good news about this man Jesus? What was it about him that did this? And we're going to think about the background now. Think about the world in which Jesus lived. Now, of course, he was Jewish. He was from the territory Israel, and he came from his upbringing was in Galilee. We'll look at that in a moment. But the Jewish nation, the people of Israel, have had a really sort of tumultuous history. That's what a lot of the Bible's about, isn't it? The Old Testament sort of goes through lots of the parts of the wanderings and the kings and the different things that happened to the people of Israel, and how they became the people of the Jews that we sort of know today. And yeah, they've had a really tumultuous history. Just to sort of try and summarize that in a really short minute or so, it involved things like being attacked by by Assyria, and part of the kingdom being taken away, people being taken away from their land, and most of the territory of Judah around Jerusalem completely decimated. And then after Assyria, it was Babylon, and Babylon destroyed Jerusalem, and most people were taken, or lots of people were taken away over into Babylon. And you think, well, that's going to be the end of that nation, that sort of race of people, that heritage. But many survived in Babylon, and some came back to their homeland, their home city, Jerusalem, and yet it wasn't anything like it was before. And ever since then, they've never had any kind of independence or anything like that. And then it was the Persians that would have controlled them, and the Greeks that controlled them. And when we get to the day of Jesus, where he comes from, this region of Galilee, it's now under the influence of all those successive generations of oppressing forces, effectively, Greeks, and now the Romans. And you can just see on that map, you might see things like Ptolemais or Sepphoris and Tiberius, these very Hellenistic Greek culture and Roman towns that are now dominating this area where Jesus was. And yet Jesus wasn't a Roman, Jesus wasn't a Greek, he was Jewish, okay? And he was from Nazareth, and Nazareth is on the map. You should be able to see it there. You know, a backwater town, village, collection of buildings up on the mountainside, where all the prosperity is in the Roman cities and towns, and yet the Jewish people have been effectively oppressed by the occupiers, and you know, this is the society in which he lived. And the Jewish people, with their what we now call the Old Testament, it was their Hebrew scriptures, it's their Bible effectively, would have had passages to think about and to look at which talked about good news, and it's that we need to just have a look at now. So that's in Isaiah. So I'm going to turn up some passages that kind of the essence of it is going to be up there. But let's have a look at some of these really key passages in Isaiah, and I'll read some of these to you. So Isaiah 40, and first couple of verses. Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her that her warfare is ended and her iniquity is pardoned, that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. So let's get into the frame of mind. We've thought a little bit about today's problems, and you know, maybe Christianity has got nothing to do with that, and how could that be good news? And what we've tried to do is transporting ourselves right back now to a Jewish settlement and the time of the Roman occupation, in the synagogue, picking up the scroll of Isaiah and reading these sorts of words. That there's a promise of comfort, that warfare, that the oppression is going to end, and that God will forgive them for the sins that they've done, which led to exile and things like that. And what is what is it that's going to happen? Verse 9 of Isaiah 40, get you up to a high mountain, O Zion, herald of good news. Lift up your voice with strength, O Jerusalem, herald of good news. Lift it up, fear not. Say to the cities of Judah, behold your God. Behold, the Lord God comes with might, and his arm rules for him. Behold, his reward is with him, and his recompense before him. So here's a herald now, and this is like some really lovely poetry, isn't it, in this prophetic scroll of this herald with good news. And he's shouting, look, there's good news for this people now, because it's your God. He's going to act for you, and he's going to rule, and he's coming with might. And you think, yeah, that's what they need. They need someone to bring a revolution, to take down the Romans, to establish some authority and dominion, and to bring, effectively demonstrate that God rules, and that he is going to rule, and not these oppressive empires and so on. Okay, so that, just think about that promise of good news that comes up. And to be honest, this comes up a lot in these passages in Isaiah that we're not going to look at them loads, these famous passages in Isaiah, but there's a really important one in Isaiah 52 and verse 7, which says this: "How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news, who publishes peace, who brings good news of happiness, who publishes salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns." And then again, there's this picture of people singing for joy because the Lord has comforted his people, he's redeemed Jerusalem. There's this prospect of Jerusalem being liberated and God showing that he reigns and he rules over and over against, kingdoms of men, that kind of thing. So good news is promised, and it, that's imagining that in this period of time in history where Jesus had lived and grew up in this period where there was all these different problems, and it did actually cause many people, revolutionaries and zealots, to form to try and drive out the Romans, and ultimately that's what caused the Romans to come in and destroy Jerusalem. So in AD 70, that's what happened. There's this idea, this image, this perception that we need good news, and good news is going to be by picking up arms and going and taking out the invaders. That's one interpretation, isn't it? That's one you can easily see why people would have thought about that, to show that the God of Israel reigns and he's in control. But what happens in the New Testament is something, completely different, isn't it? If you're familiar with Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, the stories of Jesus, you'll know that things go in a very different way from that. Jesus comes along, he starts proclaiming things like the kingdom of God. So yeah, the reign of God. He's proclaiming that God's going to reign. He's talking the language of the revolutionaries. He's talking the language of that people needed to hear. That he's even talking the language of good news. So Mark chapter 1, for example, Mark chapter 1 and verse 17, well, it's verse 14. Jesus came into Galilee. So there's that region we had up on the map a few moments ago. Jesus came into Galilee proclaiming the gospel of God. Gospel's a funny word that, it's been translated into this. We've got it in our English now as gospel, but really it's good news. That's what it means. Okay, so we're talking about good news. Well, Jesus is proclaiming the good news of God and saying the time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe in the good news. Okay, so he's talking the language of Isaiah. He's talking the language of, yes, this is what you need. Downtrodden people, oppressed people. This is what you need. And in fact, the gospel writers, there's that word. Okay, we know them as Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or the Gospel according to Matthew, the Gospel according to Mark, and so on. These four documents that describe what happened to Jesus, his teaching, his life, and his death. They describe the things about Jesus. And for example, Mark chapter 1, verse 1, the beginning of the gospel, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it's written in Isaiah the prophet, behold, I send my messenger before your face who prepare your way, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. So he's quoting there from a couple of prophets, one in Malachi, we didn't look at that, but he's then also quoting from Isaiah chapter 40, passage, a verse that we didn't read, but right there in the good news section of Isaiah. Okay, there's that big section in Isaiah, which is this good news, comfort to Jerusalem. And Mark says, this is the beginning of the good news of Jesus, which comes right from Isaiah. Okay, this good news that we need to show that God reigns, that the kingdom of God is going to come. Okay, so they're claiming that Jesus was this fulfillment, that Jesus was good news. because of all these things. But if you're familiar with Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, if you're familiar with the story of Jesus, it's something completely different, isn't it? It's not a revolution. It's not overthrowing the Romans. It's not taking up arms. Jesus specifically tells people to put down the sword. Jesus assembles a group of different people who've come from different backgrounds. Some of those actually were zealots, or they were people that that had that kind of aspiration to sort of overthrow the Roman occupation. And some of them were people who were actually dabbling with the Roman authorities and making a good living out of it by being tax collectors and getting good commission. And he assembles all these different people together, his close followers, his disciples. He teaches people a lot. He goes about showing that he's the one promised in the Old Testament by healing people to show that he is the one to bring God's kingdom. And then he goes to Jerusalem and he dies, and he's killed. He's taken and he's killed. And that's what the Gospels present. They present him with a great following, people who even wanted to make him king there and then, who wanted to crown him and make him take on the Romans. But he was taken, he's crucified, and he's buried. And yet they still call this good news. They still call this the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Okay. So we need to think about, why is this? Why was Jesus still good news? Even though it looked like his mission failed. On one level, it looks like his mission on transforming the world and making a better place, it looks like it's failed, doesn't it? And in one thing. Just before we answer that a little bit, let's just think about what this word good news in the Greek, this word gospel, is. Because as well as the background from Isaiah, which is the Jewish background to it, it's also the word in the Greek, euangelion, has a very much of a Greek or Roman background to it as well. And remember, we're trying to get into to what's happening on the ground. We're trying to park all our presuppositions and what Christianity has become and all those sorts of things. We're trying to get into the life of the people on the ground at the time of Jesus. And the word euangelion, good news, good tidings, gospel, was used for when good news proclaiming things like a new emperor, particularly Emperor Augustus. There's an inscription, the calendar inscription at Priene, which has this. It refers to it's a very wordy inscription. You can try and make sense of it all if you like. But the important thing there is about it's basically praising and proclaiming the birthday of Augustus. It was the beginning of the good news, the good tidings for the world that came by reason of him. And it's Augustus that brought the Pax Romana, the time of peace and prosperity, seemingly throughout the Roman Empire. There's turbulent periods of Roman history. There's lots of periods of Roman history, weren't there, where all the Roman leaders basically were assassinated one after another, and there were civil wars and legion against legion and things like that. And Augustus established this period of time where there wasn't any of that. There was peace, there was prosperity. Peace and prosperity that relied on force, effectively, to establish it, though. Peace and prosperity that relied on putting down any opposition. But he was successful in doing it, and that was good news, apparently. This is part of the background to that word. So when Jesus goes around and proclaims good news, and when the gospel writers say this is good news, euangelion, this is good news about Jesus, they're not only saying this is something from Isaiah, they're also saying, look, this is a challenge to the Roman way of doing things, the way of doing things which is, we're in charge, we're going to force and put down any opposition, and we're going to bring peace and prosperity to those who have already got it, and put down those who challenge it. Jesus, if he's bringing good news, is quite clearly a challenge to this way of doing things. Okay. But why on earth is Jesus still good news if he ended up dead? And there's two things to answer that. And the first is this, and this is a whole topic in itself. But the first of this is, well, what happened next? And I'm not going to spend time on any evidence for this, because that's a whole wonderful thing to look at, to try and work out the background to what happened after the death of Jesus. What happened on the third day? Why did people go around saying that they'd seen him alive again? And why should that be? But this is what happened in Acts 2, and we read about, well, this is Peter, one of his close disciples, one of those who'd been assembled to be with him. Those disciples, they basically fled when he'd been killed. They fled, and they thought that he was the one that was going to establish this kingdom, to bring about this good news. And they even say that there's somewhere in Luke it says about that some downtrodden disciples, they're basically walking away from Jerusalem. Everything's gone. We've given up. We thought he was the one. He's been killed. He's been crucified. And as they're chatting away, and they've basically given up because, a Messiah, someone who was going to be the one to bring that good news, shouldn't have died in their view. That's it. That takes away the claim of him being the one to bring all this to pass. And that's what they thought. But in Acts chapter 2, Peter, one of those disciples, he's explaining something very different. Verse 22, men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with mighty works and wonders and signs that God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves know. This Jesus, delivered up according to this definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. That's what we've seen so far. Verse 24, God raised him up, loosing the pangs of death, because it was not possible for him to be held by it. And the rest of what he goes on to say is putting this claim out there that Jesus has been raised from the dead, that he's been resurrected, that Jesus lives again. And what that means, let's just have a look at a few more of these verses. So verse 32, this Jesus God raised up, and of that we all are witnesses. So he's basically saying, look, we've seen him. We didn't think it was going to happen. After he was killed, we went off and did our own thing. I even went fishing, took up my fishing nets again and went off and did that, and thought I just need to go back to my job now, because this whole kind of kingdom thing isn't going to happen. It's not working out as we thought. But we witnesses to him, and we're going to tell you all about it. And then he says the point of this is verse 36, let everyone know for certain that God has made him both Lord and Christ, this Jesus whom you've crucified. So he is the Lord, he is the Christ, he is the one who is to bring this good news. He is the King. We thought it was going to be like this. It's turned out in a very different way than what we thought. But the fact that he lives again is proof that he is the one that brings good news, and it does bring true hope. And yet we can look at all the different evidence and think about the psychology of why, how this claim would have come about, and all those sorts of things. And there's a whole study and look at, which is really useful to do, to look at reasons and why believe their claim for the resurrection, which is really, really fascinating to do. But the really important thing is here just to think they did not expect it. They weren't anticipating this at all. They absolutely had gone away from the scene thinking that they needed to go back to their lives, and yet they still made this claim, a completely outlandish claim in their, what they would have thought, to go around and tell people expecting a revolutionary Messiah figure to bring about the good news by destroying the Romans, to say that, yes, this one is the one that was killed, the one that was executed, crucified. He's been raised from the dead. And he's now telling us to preach a message. He's now telling us to use words, to go out and teach people how to live. That's the Messiah, and he's good news. That's a revolutionary idea, because it completely turned their world upside down, and their worldview changed. But the reason it's good news is because if he has been raised from the dead, then it is proof. It's proof that he is the one. And the second reason why it's good news is because of what he said and how he imagined his kingdom to be like, and how he imagined people to act, and how Jesus was teaching and guiding and explaining to his followers that the way of the kingdom, the way of the people who wish to be part of that kingdom, is to be different. It's not to be like the Romans, who would establish that peace and prosperity by putting down any opposition. It's not to be like that. It wasn't to be like the revolutionaries and the zealots who wanted to destroy the Roman occupation. It's very different. It's very counterintuitive. And this section in Matthew, so Matthew's Gospel, chapters 5, 6, and 7, is probably the most critical part of the teaching, or the most condensed summary of the teaching of Jesus and what he stood for, and what he said his disciples should be and how they should act. And it's this completely upside down way of viewing life, where he says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, they shall inherit the earth." You know, all these people who are the downtrodden, who are the oppressed, they're the ones that will be comforted, that will have what they need. They'll inherit the kingdom of heaven. They'll inherit these things. They'll be a light to the world. They'll guide people. They'll show people how to live their life. And then what does he then go on to do? He goes on to talk to them about, well, verse 21, "You've heard that it's been said, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you, everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment." He's talking about violence, and not just about the act of murder. He's talking about, well, look, there's something important actually that we need to learn from this, and that's about controlling our anger. He's promoting a non-violent way of doing things, of living life, and showing that it comes from within and it starts with anger, and actually to not be like that is the important way of living. He's talking in verse 38 about, "You've heard that it's said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for the tooth." Well, the Romans have come in, they've destroyed lots of things, they've oppressed us. Well, let's turn back, let's fight them back. And he's saying, no, don't resist anyone who is evil. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. If anyone would sue you, take your tunic, let him have your cloak also. If anyone forces you to go a mile, go with him 2 miles. This is not a way of retaliating, a way of fighting back, a way of resisting. This is a way of turning around and demonstrating compassion, a way of demonstrating love, of not having anger, not having violence, and being helpful and compassionate to even your very enemies. That's what verse 43 says. "You've heard that it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." And in the time that we've been thinking about, this is unbelievable. This is that he should teach these things, to pray for the Romans, to pray for the people who are oppressing them, to pray for people who are evil against them. And this is the way he's talking about how people should live. Now, so let's just zoom out again. He's throughout all these chapters, they're full of these incredible pieces of guidance, of instruction, and of wisdom. And if people live by those and they follow Jesus, knowing that he lives again, that was how good news was brought to so many people throughout the Roman Empire in all that time, all those years ago. That's how Jesus was good news to the slaves, to the people who were lower down the pecking order in the Roman hierarchy. That's how Jesus was good news to the people who were mistreated. That's how he was good news to so many people in society, to all the different classes and races. He was good news to so many different people because he taught a new way of living, a better way of living, a way of community, and a way of love to one another. That's what he taught. And it was real because he lives again. It was real, and it brought them hope and he lives again, and he will actually we're in Matthew, aren't we? Matthew 6. As well as living like this now, he says this is part of his explanation to the disciples about pray like this. He says, "Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name." Verse 10, "Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." So there's this recognition that we live like this now, and we pray for God's kingdom to come, and it will come and be realized fully. And the fact that he lives again, it shows that that's going to happen, that this will be fully realized. And those who are living like it now will experience that in the fullest when he comes again. So why was Jesus good news all that time ago? Hopefully we've been parachuted into the first century. We've been able to think a little bit about that, get into the frame of mind of what the issues were at that time in the culture and the place and in the time of Jesus. And that's why he was good news. And now let's think about, okay, how is this good news for today? And the presentation of what I've said Jesus stood for, and what his life, his teaching, his death, and then his resurrection, in a nutshell, what it meant to people. There's so much more, obviously, of course, about what it meant about personal accountability, sin and forgiveness, and all sorts of different things. But in a nutshell, what it meant to communities and how it could build people to love one another because they were following Jesus instead of just acting on impulse and selfishness. That could create a place that was waiting for God's kingdom to fill this world, and yet was showing this in the way that they lived in their day-to-day lives in that harsh Roman world. That's how he was good news to all those people. So how is he good news today? And really, there is no difference anymore. There's no difference from how it worked back then. Remember the perception of Christianity, this kind of individualistic transaction where we just need to believe him and we'll float off to heaven, we'll leave behind all these problems in the earth. There's no justice in that. There's no restoration of the world. And yet Jesus is good news. He's good news for all these issues and problems, because if we all just live by them, if we all live by his teaching, if we all pick up the Sermon on the Mount and act according to these ways and show compassion and show love and pray for enemies and so on, if we all just did that, these problems would just evaporate, wouldn't they, to some degree? That's effectively the end goal, people living by the things of Jesus. And that would undermine all those problems of cost of living and rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer, and turning away the refugees who need help, and war in parts of Europe, and all those problems. If everyone could take on this and live by it, that is a way forward, a way to bring good news, a way to bring justice to this. But the fact that Jesus has been resurrected, that he lives again, that he's coming again, is all the more reason why there's good news, because justice can be brought to this world. Good will overcome evil. And there's hope of this restored world. There's hope of a world where we all care for this world and this creation, this environment. And that's how Jesus is good news for today. It's not about the good news, the gospel of Jesus. The gospel, the teaching of Christianity isn't this kind of personal salvation that we don't have to talk about in society. It's not about sort of escaping judgment yourself and not worrying about the rest of the world. The good news, the things that Jesus stood for, is about this personal and communal responsibility, isn't it? It's about God proving that he's going to fix the world's problems, proving that he's serious about it, because he gave his son, because Jesus came and Jesus taught these things, and Jesus gave his life. He went to his death and gave himself to demonstrate that he is serious about bringing good news and about bringing God's reign to the earth. And so that a short summary, a way of summarizing the fact that Jesus is indeed good news for today. And I hope that you pick up, maybe just start with the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew's chapters 5, 6, and 7, and imbibe those chapters. Think about the teaching of Jesus. Start with that. Start with the things of Jesus and realize how he really is good news for all of society today, and then work from there and realize that there really is this promise of good news and salvation and of hope for the whole world.